They say some moments stay with you forever. Not the good ones, the bad ones. The ones that twist in your stomach like a knife, that wake you up in the middle of the night, gasping, drenched in cold sweat. The ones you wish you could erase, undo, pretend never happened. But no matter how many times you replay it in your head, some things can never be undone. It's been 2 years. 2 long, exhausting years. And yet, sometimes I swear I can still feel the air from that night, thick, electric, suffocating. I can still hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Still see the way he looked at me in that moment. The way I looked back. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It was never supposed to be like this. I was a wife, a mother, a woman who thought she had control over herself. I thought I knew where the lines were, what was right, what was wrong. I thought I could never become one of those women. The ones who make mistakes they can't take back. The ones who lose themselves in something they never saw coming. But here's the thing about mistakes. They don't start as mistakes. They start as moments. Small, harmless moments that seem so innocent at first. A glance, a conversation, a laugh that lingers just a little too long. And before you know it, you're standing at the edge of something you swore you'd never touch, heart racing, pulse hammering, knowing you should turn around, but you don't. It all started with a favor. A simple favor. The kind you say yes to without even thinking, because why would it be a big deal? My friend's 18-year-old cousin needed a place to stay, just for a few nights, just until he got settled in. That was it. That was all it was supposed to be. But I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't know that letting him into my home was the beginning of the end. By the time I realized what was happening, what I was doing, it was already too late. Before I get into what happened next. Before I tell you how everything unraveled, you need to understand who I was before that night. Because if you don't understand that, you'll never truly understand why it happened at all. I was 36. Married. Comfortable. Or at least, that's what I told myself. My husband and I had been together for almost a decade, and over time, things had settled into this quiet, predictable rhythm. Not bad. Not good. Just there. You wake up, you go through the motions, you talk about groceries, about bills, about whose turn it is to take the car for maintenance. You share the same bed, but there's this invisible wall between you, this space where something used to be. Something that's long since faded, but neither of you ever talk about it. Because talking about it would mean admitting that something is missing. Some nights, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing, wondering when the last time was that he actually looked at me. Not saw me, really looked at me. Like I was someone worth noticing. And if I was being honest with myself, I couldn't remember. We weren't fighting. There were no screaming matches, no slamming doors. Just distance. Just a slow, quiet drifting apart until we felt like strangers who happened to share the same space. And then, there was my friend. We've known each other for years. She's the kind of friend who always has a story, who always knows someone who's going through something wild. And that day, over coffee, she was telling me about her cousin. Alex. He had just moved to town for college. Didn't know many people yet, still getting used to the city. She spoke about him fondly, like a little brother she had watched grow up. She said he was a good kid. Smart. Kind. One of those rare people who just gets you. Then she asked the question. Casual, effortless, like it was nothing. Like she had no idea what she was setting in motion. Hey, would it be okay if he crashed at your place for a few nights? Just until he gets settled in. I hesitated. Not because I thought anything would happen, God, no. That thought didn't even exist in my mind. But because I wasn't used to having company. My husband was barely home. Work kept him late most nights, and even when he was there, he wasn't really there. I had gotten used to the silence, to the empty spaces. The idea of someone else being around felt different. But then I thought, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe having someone else in the house, even just for a little while, would make things feel less hollow. So I said yes. I didn't know it then, but that small favor was about to change everything. The night Alex moved in, it was nothing special. No warning signs. No slow-motion realization of what was about to unfold. Just another evening, another quiet moment in my life that should have meant nothing. He showed up with one duffel bag, a polite smile, and that effortless charm that made you feel like you had his full attention. He was young, 18, but there was something about him. He wasn't like the other boys his age. He carried himself differently, spoke differently. There was a quiet confidence in him, a way he looked at you like he really saw you. I showed him the guest room, told him to make himself comfortable. He thanked me, told me he wouldn't be any trouble. And he wasn't. He was polite, respectful, a guest who knew his place. But there were moments. Small, fleeting moments that didn't feel like anything at the time, but looking back, I can see them for what they were. The first cracks forming, the first signs that something was shifting. The first time I really noticed it was in the kitchen. I was making coffee. Just another morning, another routine. He walked in, still a little groggy from sleep, stretching, yawning. And then our hands brushed. Just for a second. Just a meaningless, accidental touch as I passed him a mug. But something happened. My breath caught. My pulse stuttered. And I pulled my hand back too quickly, like I'd touched something I wasn't supposed to. Why did I react like that? It was nothing, right? But it didn't stop there. It was in the little things. The way he listened when I spoke, not just nodded along absent-mindedly like my husband did, but listened. Like he cared. Like what I was saying actually mattered. It was the way he laughed at my jokes, the way he noticed things about me no one had noticed in years. You have this little crease right here when you're thinking too hard. I didn't know what to say. No one had looked at me close enough to notice something like that in a long time. Then there was the night of the movie. Just an ordinary night. We had both been home, nothing else to do, so we decided to watch something. Something light, something easy. I don't even remember what it was. But I remember him. I remember how close he was on the couch, how his presence filled the space in a way I wasn't used to. I remember how he laughed at the funny parts, how his body relaxed against the cushions, how comfortable he was, like he belonged there. And then, somewhere in the middle of it, he fell asleep. I should have just turned off the TV and gone to bed. I should have thrown a blanket over him and walked away. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, watching him. Just for a moment. He looked so peaceful, so at ease. And for the first time in longer than I cared to admit, I felt something. Something dangerous. Something I didn't want to name. I shook it off. Got up. Told myself it was nothing. But that night, when I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, my husband sleeping soundly beside me, I felt it. This nagging, restless energy inside me, like something had shifted and I didn't know how to put it back. I should have stopped it then. But I didn't. I told myself it was nothing. Just a fleeting moment. A silly, meaningless reaction that would pass. But the thing about thoughts like that? They don't just go away. They settle in, burrow deep, waiting for the right moment to surface again. The next morning, I was different. Not on the outside, I was the same wife, the same woman, the same person I had always been. But inside, something was shifting. I caught myself paying attention to things I never used to. The way I dressed around the house, had I always put on just any old thing in the mornings? Had I always walked around in oversized t-shirts and messy hair without thinking twice? But now I lingered a little longer in front of the mirror. Now I reached for something that fit a little better, something that felt intentional. This is ridiculous. He's just a kid. I'm imagining things. It's all in my head. But then, there were his eyes. I started noticing the way he looked at me. It wasn't obvious, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I felt it. Quick glances that lingered just a second too long. The way his gaze would drop, like he was trying to catch himself, like he wasn't supposed to be looking. And the way it made something inside me stir, something I had buried for years. I pretended not to notice. I told myself I was imagining it. But I felt it. And that feeling, that rush, that flicker of something warm and forbidden. I hadn't felt that in so long. And then, one night, it happened. We were sitting in the kitchen. Late. My husband was out, another late shift, another excuse. It was just me and Alex, sitting across from each other, talking about nothing and everything. And then, he said something that I haven't been able to shake since. He said, "I think people don't really see each other anymore. They just exist next to each other." I swear, I stopped breathing for a second. Because those words, they weren't just words. They were my life. They were my marriage. The quiet. The distance. The way my husband and I passed each other in the hallways like ghosts, sharing a house, but not a life. Not really. Not anymore. And Alex. Alex had seen it. He had seen me. I should have laughed it off. I should have changed the subject. But instead, I just sat there, staring at him across the dimly lit kitchen, feeling something between us shift. I don't know if it was in my head or if it was real. But in that moment, it felt like the air between us had thickened, like we were both aware of something unspoken pressing down on us. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to break eye contact, to look away. Because if I didn't know what would happen next. After that night in the kitchen, things changed. Not in a way anyone else would notice, but I did. It was in the way we moved around each other, the way we spoke, the way we didn't. The air between us was different now, heavier, charged with something neither of us wanted to name. It started with small things. A touch that lasted a second too long. A glance that held too much. Moments that should have meant nothing, but somehow meant everything. One afternoon, I had gone grocery shopping. Just a normal day, a normal errand. When I pulled into the driveway, Alex came outside to help. He grabbed the bags from the trunk, his fingers brushing against mine as he did. And instead of pulling away, instead of stepping back, I let it linger. It was only a second. Maybe less. But in that second, everything slowed down. I could feel the warmth of his skin, the quiet strength of his hands. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I wasn't supposed to feel. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it. But as I watched him carry the bags inside, as I caught the way he glanced at me over his shoulder, I knew I wasn't imagining anything. Then there was the night the power went out. It had been storming all evening. One of those heavy, endless rains that make the whole world feel smaller, quieter. I was in the living room when it happened. Everything went dark in an instant. Just the sound of rain against the windows, the faint flicker of lightning outside. And then, his voice. "Guess we're roughing it tonight." We lit candles. Sat at the kitchen table, the glow of the flames casting shadows across his face. The storm outside felt distant, like it was happening in another world. And somehow, in that dim, flickering light, we started talking. Really talking. He told me about his life, about things I hadn't asked before. About his childhood, his dreams, the things he wanted but didn't have the words for yet. And I told him things I hadn't said out loud in years. About how lonely I was. About how a house could feel so empty even when someone else was in it. About how I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. He listened. Not like my husband did, distracted, half there. He listened like every word mattered. Like I mattered. And the way he looked at me. God. I should have looked away. I should have ended the conversation. But I didn't. I couldn't. The rain kept falling. The candles kept burning. And between us, something had shifted. I don't know how long we sat there. I only know that when I finally stood to blow out the candles, my hands were shaking. Because I knew. This wasn't just in my head anymore. I wasn't the only one feeling it. He was too. If I had stopped it then, maybe things wouldn't have gone too far. I should have stopped it. That night with the candles, the rain, the way he looked at me, I should have felt the danger and turned away. But I didn't. And once you step too close to a fire, you don't always realize you're burning until it's too late. It happened late one night. My husband was working late again, of course, he was. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath our feet. Alex and I were in the living room, neither of us tired, both of us pretending we weren't waiting for something neither of us could name. We started talking. At first, it was nothing. Just words filling the space between us. Then the words got deeper. The silences stretched longer. And before I knew it, I was telling him things I shouldn't have been saying. Things I hadn't even admitted to myself. Do you ever feel like you're just existing? I asked him, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his eyes dark and searching, as if he was deciding whether to say something he wasn't supposed to. All the time, he finally said. I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight, like I had said too much, like I had let him see too much. But then he spoke again, his voice softer this time. You're not invisible, you know. I felt something inside me crack wide open. Because that's exactly what I had felt for so long. Invisible. Unnoticed. Like I could fade away and no one would even see me go. But Alex saw me. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was both of us at the same time, drawn together by something we couldn't fight anymore. All I know is that suddenly we were too close. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. My body was screaming at me to move away. To stop this. To say something that would break whatever spell had pulled us into this moment. But I didn't move. And neither did he. And then it happened. The kiss. It was brief. Just a whisper of lips against lips. But it was like the world had cracked open beneath me. Because in that single moment, nothing else existed. Not my husband. Not my marriage. Not the years I had spent convincing myself that I was fine. There was only him. Only us. Only this impossible, intoxicating pull that neither of us had the strength to fight anymore. And then, just as quickly as it happened, it was over. I pulled back first. My breath was shaky, my mind racing. My whole body felt like it had been struck by lightning. I couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. This is wrong, I whispered, my voice barely there, like I was trying to convince myself more than him. But then Alex looked at me. And in the dim light of the living room, with his face just inches from mine, he said the words that changed everything. Then why does it feel so right? I didn't have an answer. I just knew that something had shifted. Something we couldn't take back. Something that would never be the same again. We parted ways that night. He went to his room. I went to mine. But the damage was already done. The next morning, everything felt different. The air was heavier, thicker, like the walls of the house knew what had happened, like the floorboards were holding onto the secret I was too afraid to speak out loud. I woke up feeling hollow, like something inside me had cracked, like I was teetering on the edge of something I didn't understand yet. My body still remembered the warmth of his lips, the way my heart had raced in a way it hadn't in years. But my mind was screaming at me, telling me that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. I tried to move through the morning like nothing had happened. Like I was still the same person I had been the day before. But I wasn't. And neither was he. Alex avoided me. I felt it the second I walked into the kitchen. He was there, making coffee, his back to me. And normally, he would have turned. He would have looked at me, smiled, said something easy, something warm. But this time, he didn't. He didn't even glance in my direction. I stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to say something, to acknowledge what had happened. But what would I even say? That I was sorry? That I regretted it? That I didn't? Before I could decide, he grabbed his coffee and walked out, barely muttering a good morning under his breath. And just like that, the distance between us had changed. Before, it had been unspoken tension, a slow build of something we couldn't control. Now it was avoidance. Now it was silence. I told myself this was good. That it meant he realized how wrong it was too. That we could move past it, pretend it never happened. But deep down, I felt something I wasn't prepared for. A sadness I couldn't explain. Because for the first time in a long time, I had felt alive. And now, in the space where that feeling had been, there was only emptiness. And my husband, he noticed nothing. Of course, he didn't. Why would he? He had been missing me long before Alex ever showed up. He came home that night like he always did, late, tired, distracted. He kissed my cheek without looking at me, asked about my day without listening to the answer, ate dinner without speaking more than a few words. And all the while I sat there, watching him, wondering how I had gotten here. How I had ended up in a life where the man who was supposed to love me had no idea that his wife had kissed another man under his own roof the night before. I should have felt relieved. I should have been grateful that he was oblivious, that there were no questions, no suspicions. But instead, I felt invisible. Like I could have disappeared right in front of him, and he wouldn't have even noticed. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, listening to his steady breathing, my mind kept replaying the moment in the living room. The way Alex had looked at me. The way he had pulled away in shock, his eyes wide with something between regret and longing. The way he had whispered, "Then why does it feel so right?" I had no answer then. And I had no answer now. All I knew was that things had changed. And there was no going back. The days that followed were the longest I had ever known. The kind of days where the minutes stretch endlessly, where every second feels heavier than the last. Where you wake up hoping, praying that somehow it was all just a dream, just a fleeting moment that never really happened. But it did happen. And I felt it everywhere. Alex and I barely spoke. We moved through the house like strangers, careful, distant, pretending. But the silence between us wasn't empty, it was filled with everything we weren't saying. Every moment we weren't acknowledging. Every glance that we avoided because we both knew that if we met each other's eyes for too long, we'd see the truth we were running from. And inside me, the war began. Do I tell the truth? Do I sit my husband down, look him in the eyes, and confess what I had done? Tell him that I had crossed a line I never thought I'd cross, that for the first time in our marriage, I had felt something for someone else? That for just a brief, fleeting moment, I had forgotten the vows I had made. Or do I let it fade? Do I bury it so deep inside me that it becomes a ghost, something that lingers in the shadows but never fully takes shape? Pretend it was nothing, that it didn't mean anything, that it didn't change me. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't erase it. Because no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was just one mistake, just one moment of weakness, I knew the truth. It wasn't just about the kiss. It was about what it meant. It was about the fact that for the first time in years, someone had seen me, had heard me, had made me feel like I existed again. And my husband? He still hadn't noticed a thing. That should have made it easier, shouldn't it? The fact that he was so wrapped up in his own world that he had no idea his wife was standing on the edge of something she couldn't come back from. But it didn't. It only made the loneliness feel heavier. It only made the guilt sink deeper into my skin. And then, just like that, Alex was gone. I woke up one morning and he was gone. No goodbyes. No explanations. Just silence. At first, I thought maybe he had gone out. Maybe he'd be back later. Maybe we'd have one more conversation, one more chance to. Her voice falters, the words unfinished. But then I saw the note. It was sitting on the kitchen table, just a single piece of paper, folded neatly. My name written on the front in his handwriting. My hands shook when I picked it up. And when I opened it, when I read the words inside, I swear my heart stopped. You deserve to be seen. I hope one day someone does. That was it. No goodbye. No explanation. Just that. I never saw him again. And to this day, I don't know if he left because he wanted to, or because he had to. But I do know one thing. He was right. And that was it. No confrontation. No dramatic ending. Just an empty space where something once was. A silence that stretched into days, then weeks, then years. I never told my husband. Maybe I should have. Maybe he deserved to know. But in the end, I convinced myself it would only hurt him. And for what? To ease my own guilt? To make myself feel less like a monster? Because that's the real question, isn't it? Was I a monster for what happened? Or just a lonely soul who made a terrible mistake? Maybe you've been here before. Maybe you know this feeling, the ache of being unseen, the slow erosion of something that once felt so solid. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you're on the other side of the story, the one who never saw it coming. But now, I ask you, was this betrayal? Or was it just human nature? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you think. What would you have done? And if you've ever found yourself standing on the edge of something you never thought you'd do, did you step back? Or did you fall? And if you want to hear more stories like this, if you want to dive deeper into the things we don't talk about, the choices we pretend we'd never make, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more shocking stories from the Shocking Infidelity Saga. Loneliness is dangerous. It's quiet. It doesn't hit you all at once. It creeps in, settles in the spaces you don't even realize are empty. And if you're not careful, it can push you to places you never thought you'd go. Don't let yourself get lost like I did.